Well, hey everyone, welcome to Your Enneagram Coach, the podcast. I am Jeff McCord, the CEO and co-founder of Your Enneagram Coach. And joining me for this conversation today is my friend and fellow team member, our director of coaching, Adam Breckenridge. We're going to get to him in a moment. But, and for those of you who are tuning in, it's our mission here at Your Enneagram Coach to help you see yourself with astonishing clarity, to help you break free from self-condemnation, fear, and shame by knowing and experiencing the unconditional love, forgiveness, and freedom in Christ. Now, if you love this content, and then turn on automatic downloads or like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. And also share this with someone that you think would enjoy or benefit from this content. Now, if you would, we are brainstorming future content constantly. And so if you're interested in future topics that are maybe related to what we're going to be talking about today, be sure to leave them in the comments. Adam and I were spending some time in answering comments this last week from previous episodes. So you can leave a comment or you can email us at info@yourenneagramcoach.com and we'd be happy to get back to you and consider it for a future episode. The last and probably the most important thing, you've heard us mention it before, but just as a reminder, Beth is on sabbatical. She has not abandoned you all, and particularly not abandoned you to Adam and Jeff. That would not. Well, actually, she has kinda, but that's not necessarily her fault. But Adam and I are here to take care of you while Beth is taking a break. Yikes! That woman. She published a book last year, took care of me and my heart crisis, and moved her parents to Nashville. So, and then had her first grandson. So she needed a break, and she is doing fantastic. So we are grateful just for your initial welcoming of Adam and I leading the podcast. And so we're hopefully going to be able to lead you well as she takes a little break. So Adam, so glad you're here, friend.
I'm so glad to be here. You know, that reminds me of that Parker Palmer quote where he said something to the effect of self-care is never a selfish act. It is simply good stewardship of the one gift I have to offer. So I'm so glad that Beth has taken some time to take care of herself. And just, praying for her during this season. So, and I'm glad that, we get to do this together. So Jeff, I'm glad you're here. And to those of you tuning in, we're glad you're here. On this episode of the
She's doing
podcast,
well. Yesterday, she spent almost the entire day hanging out with a friend and
good for
then
her.
doing some recovery work, reading in this wonderful place we call the Factory in Franklin. And I got to go and grab coffee and hang out with her and do some work with her. So she's sabbaticaling. Well, is that a word? Sabbaticaling?
It is now.
Is now.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
It is.
it is now. It's going to be by this afternoon. It will be in the Urban Dictionary.
Awesome.
And so, hey, we're so glad you all are tuning in, and we have an amazing guest, and I'm so excited to introduce him on this episode of the podcast. We're going to be talking about the Enneagram and Attachment Theory. And our guest and conversation partner for this episode is Dr. Todd Hall. Dr. Hall is a professor of psychology at Biola University's Rosemead School of Psychology, and he serves as a faculty affiliate in the Harvard Human Flourishing Program. He has authored and contributed to several books, and his latest book is The Connected Life, The Art and Science of Relational Spirituality. And he brings with him over 30 years of experience helping leaders, coaches, and entrepreneurs achieve deep relational and spiritual growth. So, Dr. Hall, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Adam and Jeff. It's great to be here with you. I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah. Now you gave me permission.
Now we agreed early on like what to call you, so we're going to call you Todd instead of Dr. Hall.
Totally
exactly
fine.
right.
So we're not trying to be disrespectful, but that was pretty impressive what you read there, Adam.
It is impressive.
Todd is a very gentle, kind, hospitable man, but you carry a resume that is significant, Todd. I mean, what was it that got you into psychology from the beginning?
Yeah, that's an interesting story and kind of connected to the writing of The Connected Life, no pun intended there. But yeah, it really did grow out of my own story of disconnection And growing up with a mom who struggled with a lot of mental health issues, parents split up when I was young, so that led to a lot of disconnection. And
Yeah.
but I became a Christian when I was quite young through friends. I did not grow up in a Christian family, and actually was blessed to have a pastor who encouraged me to go into psychology or to check it out. I originally started off wanting to be a pastor and kind of going down that road for a little bit, and then my pastor encouraged me to think about psychology. I started checking it out and really just kind of fell in love with it, and started to see that it seemed like there were some really great tools there for my own growth, but also for
Yeah.
for ministry.
And that would have
Mm.
been a big deal because Christianity and psychology have not always had a good relationship.
That is correct, Jeff. It's been a
Yeah. So to
yeah
have a pastor say, "Hey, go that route,"
ongoing tension.
and
Yes, yes, and I feel very blessed by that because even today, it's gotten a little better, I would say. So I've been involved in this conversation and teach in this area of what we call the integration of psychology and theology, and we've definitely made progress of how do we bring these two fields together and
hmm
think well about this. And so I think we have made progress, but there are, I would say, also pockets of folks in the church who have kind of become more entrenched in a stance that psychology is bad, sort of
yeah,
anti-psychology. So I still have students come who have pretty painful experiences in the church with church leaders in that realm. So I do feel very blessed that this pastor was in my life and really encouraged me to go that route. So I never really had to
yeah.
deal with that at a
Wow,
personal
that's
level.
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Adam is well experienced in bringing principles of psychology into pastoral ministry. And Adam, you did some research and put some thoughts together on this topic that we're going to be addressing today, the disconnected life and loneliness. Why don't you share about
Yeah.
some of the things that you learned?
Yeah. Well, it was I love your book, The Connected Life, Todd, and
Thank
it's
you.
really getting at our relational design and the life of connection that we're made for, and it's addressing a major pain point in the human experience, which is the opposite of a life of connection is a life of disconnection and a life of loneliness. And we know that sociologists all across the West are calling loneliness an epidemic now. I'm
Yes.
sure you're familiar. There was a report that came out in 2017 called the Commission on Loneliness that said that of
Mhm.
those who participated in the survey, more than 9 million people marked that they often or always feel lonely. And they went on in that report. It was crazy. They talked about the effect this has on our souls and our bodies. There was
Mm.
a line in there that said that loneliness kills. It's proven to be worse for health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Yes.
Loneliness leads to greater risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, depression, anxiety, and then they threw in this kind of scary line of young or old, loneliness doesn't discriminate. Um,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
It's crazy. And then I saw, in recent years, of course, Britain, created a new government position called the Minister of Loneliness,
Right.
whose job is just to establish policies that address, the long-term impact that loneliness has on individuals and society. And there was a line in your book that where all this sort of comes together. And you say in there, in a time when nearly half of Americans are reporting loneliness and disconnection as an epidemic, we need healthy attachment bonds,
Mm.
uh, perhaps now more than ever. So, I think a great place to start would be maybe to have, if you will, tell us a little more about your heart for this need, and
Mhm, mhm.
how this book is addressing that need.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Adam. And definitely loneliness is a huge issue. And yeah, my heart for this need and the book really does grow out of my story, as I mentioned a moment ago, of growing up with quite a bit of disconnection and then um, finding the resources spiritually and socially and relationally to work through, those things and learn how to connect, in a more secure way and develop secure attachment with God and other people. And so, I think I experienced that myself first in my own life in college and then in graduate school, at Rosemead. We w- so I now teach at Rosemead, as you mentioned, and we're one of the few programs in the country that actually requires our students to go through their own therapy process. And our
Wow.
deep belief, and mine is, if you're going to help people as a therapist, or, and that applies to coaching or any kind of helping role, you need to be on your own journey of growth and developing self-awareness. And so we take that seriously. I sometimes say to my students, you are the tool. That's
Mm.
what I experienced in my own therapy and growth process, and then working with clients for 30 years now. And that's what the research bears out. When you look at the outcome research on therapy, it's the relationship that really heals. So experiencing that myself in my own growth process really awakened me to the importance of this um, growth process, and the importance of relationships, not only in just general life, but in spiritual life as well. And I started to see how our early relationships impact our experience of God. And I experienced that again in my own life, and then working with clients, which is really what got me into the research. Interestingly, I worked mainly with Christian clients early on in my career, and I saw that pretty much to a person, people who clients I saw who struggled with, a background of trauma or abuse or disconnection, whatever it was, I saw that play out in their relationship with God in terms of their deep experience, right? Even if they were committed, knew a lot about God in their head, different way of knowing. We'll talk about that. But there was almost always this parallel experience in their relationship with God. So that got me into looking at attachment
Mm.
theory, which I was exposed to in graduate school, and then looking at attachment to God. How does this play out in our relationship with God? And so I ended up doing research in that area, and just seeing
Mm.
that I think this is crucial for spiritual growth and formation, and the church, and especially Christian
Absolutely.
leaders really, really need to understand this. And especially, so back to your question, Adam, just this moment we're living in with all this loneliness, it's especially relevant right now because it is a crisis. Dr. Murthy, as you mentioned, has been
Yeah.
the U.S. Surgeon General. Yeah, he's been
Hmm.
talking about this for a while. He has a fairly recent book called Together.
Yep. I read it. Yeah. Yeah.
Great
It's
book
fantastic. Uh-huh.
talking about this. You mentioned the study on mortality, that loneliness is impacts has a negative impact on mortality rates, and so that comes from a big meta-analysis study by a researcher named Julianne Holstad-Lund. And interestingly, I just heard her speak at the American Psychological Association. It was a what they call a main stage event um, focused on loneliness. So that's an indication of how much of a crisis this is, how big of a topic that at the American
Yeah.
Psychological Association, they had a keynote, talk on loneliness. So yeah, it's been, we're hearing more about it now, but it's been growing really for the last 50 years. So, in
Mm.
the last 50 years, we've seen a, increase in loneliness and social isolation, and decline in community involvement and participation. And a lot of that work was done by Robert Putnam in his book Bowling Alone, if you're familiar with that. And he's done some work since then. So he really documented a lot of that. So it's been going on for a while. And then we have, you layer on top of that the pandemic and the impact
The,
of
the
technology and
digital
smartphones,
age. Oh yeah.
digital
Hmm.
age, right, on kids. And so Jonathan Haidt, if you're familiar with him, is a psychologist doing some great work in this area. He's got a recent book that just came out called The Anxious Generation. And
Hmm.
so he argues basically the kind of the big thesis of the book is that the shift from what he calls a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood is a
Oh
major
wow.
reason why children born after 1995 became what he calls the anxious generation. And he says that the smartphones acted like experience blockers that made it
Mm.
difficult for children and adolescents to get the embodied social experiences they need. So, you layer that on top, and we've got this breakdown of community and family. We've got the rise of technology that's really impacting our young adults, and it's just a recipe for disaster, the perfect storm, right? Where we just have so
Oh yeah.
much loneliness and disconnection, and it plays out in our spiritual lives, because if we understand spirituality to be about relationship, right? Relationship with God, relationship with each other in the body of Christ, where we are supposed to shine God's light to the world, right? And display God's love to the world, then it has to impact our spiritual
Hmm.
lives.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's interesting,
Hmm.
Todd. Here you're talking about the Anxious Generation book. I my childhood, In one sense, my parents stayed together. I was adopted, so I never looked like my parents, and it was made known to me very early on. So there was a certain disconnect there that I'm
Mhm.
not like them, and they had their own story, but they never divorced, but there were
Mhm.
other things involved. And then I think about my childhood. I mean, we were like a little gang in our neighborhood. We were either playing soccer at the tennis court, wiffle ball in the driveway, football in the street, or riding our bikes around the neighborhood and just going house to house getting water because we were in Texas, getting water and food from just foraging around the neighborhood. And it's interesting though that I wonder, being Gen X, if loneliness just shows up a little bit differently because I don't think that the younger generations now kind of get the market on loneliness, but there's certainly always been loneliness in
Mhm.
some ways as we have experienced. I mean, it seemed like that was an immediate implication of the fall for Adam and Eve is separation from God, separation from one another, in this sense of loneliness in the world, and even maybe some kind of disconnection from creation itself, where things weren't going to
Mhm.
function as well as in. So now,
Hmm.
how do I live out my sense of purpose and calling? Um, yeah, I mean, it was just interesting to hear you say that because I'm like, I don't know if Gen X would be considered a
Mhm.
connected generation.
Yeah. Well, yeah, certainly there's loneliness across the
Yeah,
generations, and it has been, growing in recent times, but the research does suggest that Gen Z, the young adults, the the rate of growth is steeper.
interesting.
There's yeah, more
There's a
more
lot of them too.
well, and anxiety and depression, but
Yeah.
loneliness
Mhm.
definitely along with that's part of what Haidt documents in his book. I mean, if you look through he shows a number of charts of different ways of kind of that the research looks at anxiety, depression, loneliness, things like this, and you can see what he highlights in these charts is from 2010 to 2015 you just see a steep incline in
Wow.
depression, anxiety, loneliness, and particularly
Yeah,
anxiety, depression also, but so it does seem steeper for them, but I think, yes, loneliness is increasing for across the generations
sure.
and probably looks different, as you've mentioned, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I mean, this is an Enneagram podcast, so we're going to be talking about the Enneagram a little bit. But one of the things that I thought would be a curious little, not tangent, it's really related to this, but to make it more specific to Enneagram types is um, the idea, how does loneliness or disconnection, how and why does it show up for each Enneagram type? And I thought it'd be kind of fun just for
Mhm.
the next couple of minutes to just walk the wheel 1 through 9 on what your thoughts may be for each type and how and why they might experience loneliness.
Yeah.
Um, and I'll lead us off for each type, and then you guys can jump in on and add your additional thoughts, and even from the thought of your own Enneagram type. But yeah, type ones, I think about number one. Ones have a tremendous sense of responsibility, and oftentimes they speak in terms of being the only one in their families who are the responsible ones, and it's very isolating for them because they're always having to do things for the sake of other people, and there's this innate inclination to take things over and to do it right or be the responsible one. I think number two, their own inner critic and self criticism just it's like ricochets right back at them, and
Mhm.
um, they don't want to engage with others because of the negative false beliefs that they may have about themselves. And then I think one of the things is that they become so principled and hold those principles so well, it almost isolates them from other people because
Mhm.
people don't may not agree with them or share the same beliefs, and so it has this ice. Even though they may have a principled view that's for the good of people, it may actually isolate them whenever someone may not agree with it. But any other thoughts about a type one and how loneliness would show up?
Yeah, no, I think that's great, Jeff, and, yeah, I don't consider myself an expert on the Enneagram, so I have to rely on you, but just thinking about these different types, I think in general, I would say, as you were just alluding to, all the types have a shadow side, right?
Hmm.
And a way that we get trapped in some way, right? Like a negative cycle. And so I'm most familiar with that for my type, which is 4. But yeah, but with the one, if there's taking responsibility and feeling like they need to, there's probably ways that that can lead to a negative cycle of disconnecting them from people in terms of how they're coming across to people, right? Where
Yeah.
it's not, they don't intend to do that, and that's the case for most of these cycles, right? But when they take things over, take responsibility, and sometimes maybe come across as I'm the only one in the room who knows how to
That's right.
do this right,
That's right.
that
That's right.
yeah, that can alienate people and probably lead to some loneliness, even though in all these cases it's a self-protective mechanism, right?
Sure.
Mhm.
It is
Mhm.
interesting too to
That's
think
yeah.
about it that one being disconnected from God and parents because they, in some ways, many ones will believe like I'm going to do a better job of parenting myself than you are,
Mm, mhm,
Mhm.
and the idea of yielding, of submission in the Bible to God. I would imagine there's a projection of who God is
mhm,
and whether or not He's going to really help them to the same with the same level of energy and aggressiveness
mhm,
that they'd want to change themselves.
mhm,
Mhm. Mhm. Yep, that's great. No, I just to triple piggyback, I think you when you something you said, Todd, triggered the thought of, they may be they may become ones may become the only person in the room that feels like I'm the only one that knows the right way. There's just an innate loneliness sometimes when if you fall into believing you're the only one holding up the high standards, or you
mhm,
are the standard of moral integrity, and so sometimes ones might feel isolated in their quest for perfection.
mhm,
And they may feel that others don't share their sense of responsibility or their desire for improvement. Why doesn't everyone else care about this as much as I do? They can often feel misunderstood and
Mhm.
lonely with their people in
Yeah.
that
mhm.
way.
Right, right.
Um, well, two's a few things that come to mind. I've written some notes down here. Um, Unreciprocated care. I
Mhm,
have been taking care of everybody else, but no one's taking care of me, which is a
mhm,
part of the self-sabotaging cycle that they get into because they're resistant to being cared for. It's almost like and Jesus' words to Peter, like, unless I wash your feet. There's this sense to where that twos will feel lonely because no, they don't feel like anyone's addressing their needs. Number two, over identifying with other people's needs to
mhm,
their own neglect. So they're just not aware of their own needs, nor do they feel comfortable because the fear of rejection is if I express my need, that's one of the rules of a dysfunctional family is that don't have
mhm,
needs. And so if you fear that you're going to be rejected whenever you voice your needs, then you have this very isolating uh, dynamic in your relationships. And particularly, in a spiritual setting, you would imagine like uh, if you're operating under the mindset that you're supposed to be continuing pouring your life out as a fragrant offering, or I beat my body and make it my slave so that after I've served others, this idea of strong language in the Bible about service, where my spirituality is expressed through service, can be very lonely because we forget these first principles that we love, we serve, we feel compassion because we
mhm,
first felt compassion.
mhm.
Thoughts
Yeah.
on any other thoughts on twos?
Yeah, no, that's great, Jeff. I definitely think being, yeah, maybe less aware or sort of pushing down their own needs is a way of coping, and that can leave them feeling isolated. And also the first thing you said about just taking care of others constantly and not feeling taken care of is exhausting. And I yeah, and if I think that's fairly common for people who identify as a two to have that kind of experience. And it's, yeah, it's very, very painful. And,
Mm.
and I think, we should say here too, and I'm sure you talk a lot about this, but just that there's a beauty and a strength to all these personality types and to the energy and the way that they relate. But there's also, as we mentioned, this shadow side. So that, yeah, we're not trying to beat up on on these different types. We all have these, but there
Right.
are ways
Yeah.
that all of us, because of the fall, get into these self-sabotaging, as you put it, um, yeah, self-defeating kinds of patterns. And for twos, it is often,
Yeah.
yeah, helping others, right? And the whole idea of the pride for the twos, right, is I don't have needs.
Yeah.
right? Like
Mhm,
everyone
mm,
else has needs, I'll be there for you, but I'm sort of above that. Of course, this is not a conscious thought process, but that can lead to some isolation and loneliness. Yeah, when
mhm.
you have that experience and sort of inhabit that way of being and relating to other people,
Yeah.
then they're not going to reach out because they don't see your needs.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, Adam, why don't you take types 3 and 4 and tell us what your thoughts are on why threes and fours would experience loneliness?
Yeah, absolutely. So a type 3 can experience loneliness. It can kinda show up in performance pressure. There can be even a disconnection from themselves. You know, threes can become a chameleon where they're sort of, you know, they can get into a shape shifting and image management with people and really become lonely with and for themselves even. Um, Not just lonely with others, but like lonely for their true self. You know, sometimes, you know, there can be this exhaustion of I'm ready to stop the charade and like just show up and be me. Of course, the fear is, will anyone love me for just being me? You know, if I
Mhm.
take off the performer hat or the successful, the achiever hat, will anyone love me just for me being who I am, not based on what I do?
Mhm.
But I think that's the innate loneliness for the three is feeling that their successes are, you know, they're valued only upon the basis of their performance or their achievement as opposed to who they are. Yeah. So
Yeah.
what else would you guys add to that?
Well, that's great, Adam. And yeah, I would just say, yeah, I think in terms of then how that plays out in relationships, right? When there's this constant need to perform, when a person who identifies as three is operating more in the kind of shadow side, maybe distressed, that again can lead to disconnection and not feeling connected. They may not be aware of that until there's some sort of breakdown, right? So maybe it's you know lack of success that they're driving for causes some of the coping mechanisms to break down, and then some of these
Mm,
feelings like come to the surface. But
mm,
when they're just operating in that, and it's I'm only relating to you in an instrumental way, right? Because I need to check some boxes off and get things done. Well, the person on the other end of that relationship has a certain experience of, I don't feel very connected to you. I don't feel seen or known or
Hmm.
like you're interested. And so I'm probably not going to reciprocate. And so again, it's another way it just leads to the breakdown of connection.
I
yeah.
remember a passage in one of Brennan Manning's books. He was speaking to Jesus' words in Matthew. And, uh, in that day, they will say, uh, "We did all these things in your name," and Jesus responds with, "But I never knew you." Like it, there's a
Mm,
sense to where separating performance from our sense of identity and being vulnerable and known. And even as we're talking through these, we're going to get into the idea of attachment styles. You can start to see how those ways of relating around need and being known and being received and cherished and responded to are essential to how we show up in our relationships. And oftentimes, whenever those initial needs are not met, really some of the unhealthy sides of these types, that's where why they're showing up in unhealthy ways. These are
mm,
mechanisms to try and to secure those essential needs that we missed at the beginning.
Right,
yeah.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And I often talk about those, Jeff, as kind of pseudo connections, right? Because
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
they're the, it's very understandable, and it's a way to protect ourselves, but it is counterproductive for relationships, healthy relationships, and for our own
Yeah.
growth. And so it leads to this kind of pseudo connection because it's layered with this attempt to protect ourselves from pain,
Yeah.
which what that does is it cuts us off from parts of ourselves.
That's
And
Yeah.
right.
that's why it has a
Yeah.
negative impact on relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy. All those coping mechanisms or simulated connections, um, they always end up as counterproductive. They actually cause the pain we're trying to avoid.
Hmm.
Well, let's talk about type fours. You know, type fours, and this is Todd. We'll let you speak to this because I believe you
I'm a four.
identify as a type four. Yeah.
Yes.
But let's just toss this one to you. How would you say for the four that loneliness is experienced, or how does it show up?
Yeah, one I was reflecting on this, just thinking about this call, and one of the things I experience quite a bit that I think is common for fours is this feeling that I'm missing something,
Yeah.
and that being in my own lane and
Mhm.
operating out of my own gifts and that sort of thing is not enough. And so I think that can, I notice when that shadow side comes up and starts operating, that can definitely lead to some loneliness. And it's a filter. So I talk about attachment as filters, Enneagram, these are all personality, these are filters of, in the sense that they filter or shape how we experience relationships and events in our lives, right? And so it kind of can sometimes filter my experience to feel disconnected and lonely because of this feeling like I'm not doing enough. People might not see me in a certain way, and I'm missing something, right? And so that's probably the need to be unique, which is common for fours, right? To kind of gain
Mhm.
that love from others because I'm unique. Um,
Mhm.
Todd, do
mhm.
you ever have the experience or the inclination to want to isolate from others? And almost as like a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Yeah, I do think that that comes up at times. I think it's more of a, kind of a reaction or coping mechanism. If
Mhm.
there's a sense of, people aren't seeing me, then I'll withdraw sometimes, and then that can become a negative, self-fulfilling
Yeah.
prophecy. Yeah.
Hmm. Um, well, I'll take 5 and 6, and then, Adam, you can finish us off with 7 through 8. So, 5s, they're just as a relational style and engaging with the world, their initial inclination is towards detachment, but particularly intellectual detachment, which means that it's detachment not only from relationships, but even detachment from emotion,
Mhm.
in order not to be overwhelmed by the world and fear of being relationally or personally depleted by the world.
Mhm.
And so, similar to maybe the fours and isolating, now each Enneagram type can isolate for different reasons. That's just kind of a human coping mechanism is isolation. But um, it, fives have an inclination to find themselves lonely. And particularly because there's underlying assumption that they don't want to be a problem. They don't want their needs to be a problem to other
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
Do you guys have any other thoughts about fives?
Mhm. Yeah, I
It
think, that's all. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Jeff. It's this, yeah, inclination to operate in their head in order to, yeah, conserve energy, like you said. And so, and there's different subtypes, as we know, of the Enneagram.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's a fear of social incompetence, right? So
Yeah.
if, as well as being drained, right? If I show up and connect, that's going to be incredibly costly for me energy wise, and so I'm going to kind of hang back and stay in my
Yeah.
head. And or also, or maybe a combination, right? That if I really start to engage socially, I'll be seen as socially incompetent. I'm not quite sure how to engage, how to start the conversation, how to carry the conversation, that kind of thing. But I can, at the intellectual level, I feel very comfortable and
Yeah.
I can manage that. And
Mhm.
so that can lead
Mhm.
to definitely, yeah, feelings of loneliness just internally, like you said, Jeff, and also relationally because
Yeah.
there's a barrier there with other people.
Yeah. Well, Adam, why don't you tell us about your loneliness as a type 6? I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah, let's what what loneliness?
What?
Um,
Not lonely. I've surrounded myself with books and people, so to overcome all of my loneliness.
yeah. There's a difference between solitude and isolation, or surrounding
Mhm,
yourself with, you know, um, resources that you think are gonna help you cope with your anxiety, but actually only further isolate you. So that's yeah, I think I often feel isolated. I mean, anxiety which is the core weakness of a 6, anxiety is fundamentally isolating. Um,
mm, mhm,
and I think in anxiety and in fear, especially if I believe that others don't understand or share my concerns or share my fears, or if I feel shamed or misunderstood around my fears or anxieties, if I get this
mm,
response of like, "Hey, it's really not that big a deal," or "Hey, get over it," or "Hey, why
mm,
aren't you hey, why don't you just trust God more?" It's like, "Oh, you don't think I thought of that?"
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. I'll just have more
Yeah.
faith. All right. That's my problem. My problem must be, intellectual, that I just don't believe God is who he is. It's like, I think that's a real isolating, lonely experience for sixes. And then,
Mhm,
as we've mentioned, one of the coping mechanisms then can be this sort of exaggerated effort of seeking reassurance. And I can turn to books, resources, mentors, experts, you name it, podcasts, whatever, to try to get some reassurance. And it actually only it can really further exaggerate the loneliness. And so that's a little bit of what it's like to be a six. Um,
Adam, a
yeah.
couple things came to mind earlier that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, and Todd's as well. Um, when I think of like Isaiah 41, fear not, for I am with you, and all of those commands related to do not
Uh-huh.
fear, do not be anxious about anything, I find it particularly lonely, as if
Hmm.
somehow like the condition by which I show up to God is somehow a disappointment to him.
mhm,
Mm.
And like I don't feel him to be near when I'm feeling it. And now I've got this guilt and
Uh-huh.
this also guilt that I've done something wrong, but also the shame. Like I don't know how to fix my anxiety because it's just so pervasive to how I engage with life. Um, I mean, it's so funny. So I walk in the mornings and I walk several miles in the morning, but I was a place kicker in college, and so I twisted my ankles a lot when I would land on the tee, the
mhm,
kickoff tee. And so I am always afraid of twisting my ankle and just being on the in front of someone's home calling Beth like, "Hey, can you come pick me up? I twisted my ankle while walking." It's just so pervasive. It's everywhere, and I'm like, well, I my anxiety is what brought me here, but then I'm
Mhm.
told that my anxiety is wrong and that I should recognize that God's with me. But the last thing that my body realizes or think expresses is that God's with me. But Todd,
Mhm.
how do you interpret an experience like that spiritually?
Yeah, yeah, I think anxiety, as you were saying, Adam, is just inherently, lonely, and again, it's a filter, right, for just how you experience God. It's and what I mean by filter too is, one way I describe it sometimes is, we don't see the filter, we see through the filter, right? So, that's just the reality that you experience based on past experiences you've had at a gut implicit level that have been internalized, and so it is your reality. And that's why when people say, like you were saying, Adam, like, oh, just, you need to trust God more or whatever, that doesn't feel good, right? Because it's not an issue necessarily of faith. It's an issue of, this is an automatic kind of experience based on past
Mhm.
relationships. And so when anxiety is there because there's been experiences of what, abandonment or whatever it is, that's a very real experience. And that's, one way to describe it is like that's the starting point for growth. You have to be aware of where you are,
That's
sort of
right.
the you are here on the
Yeah.
map of your soul, right? If you're going to, move. So I think that's a very, understandable, normal experience, Jeff. Based, I don't know all the, nuances of where that comes from, but I often tell people, it helps to understand those definitely, but it's important to take your experience at face value in a certain sense, in the sense that
Yeah.
it is valid. There's a good emotional reason for why you have those experiences. And then
Mhm.
it's just a matter of
Mm.
understanding them and having new contrast experiences that then shift our attachment
Mhm. Yeah.
filters. So
Yeah.
yeah, so when you're having that experience with God and spiritually, wait a minute, the way I'm showing up, it isn't good enough because of what I'm reading in scripture. I think that's the filter operating, and that's normal and understandable given your experiences. And then that's the
Mm.
starting point. Okay, where did this come from? How can I take a step, to
Yeah.
process this and move in a more healthy direction to have a different experience? And that's not a Jeff thing, right? That's a human thing. That's all of
Yeah.
us
That's
That's
need to
right.
right.
do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said.
Well, let's jump to type seven. One of the big thoughts that I had about the seven is the idea of avoidance of suffering or being trapped in pain. And so there's a restlessness, a hunger to move towards life. and new experience. I can't remember what pastor it was that said it, but it was a provocative comment that I've always landed. It's always stuck with me. Is we admire one another for our successes, but we connect with one another in our suffering.
Mm,
Mm.
yeah.
And there's so often in the life of Christ that's portrayed in the New Testament about participating in his suffering, having fellowship with his suffering, like that's where we connect with one another. But there's such a strong inclination to be avoidant to those things for the seven that it can feel very lonely. And you even see it for some of them where they move from relationship to relationship, and looking for the new experience, particularly if things start to get difficult. And that restlessness for life can be quite lonely, because
Mhm.
they're wanting something that maybe this world doesn't have to offer yet. Even
Yep.
children, the seven
Mm,
kids will talk about growing up with parents who are always having to tell them no, and that can be
mhm,
very lonely. They were ready to experience life and do everything and anything. I was just
mhm,
talking to a seven recently who wanted to keep working while doing an overseas trip, and came back like, I often overestimate my capacity. So even like feeling alone because they're not coming through for others and overbook themselves. Do you
mhm,
Mm.
guys have any other thoughts about sevens?
Yeah, I could jump in and just say that one of the things that comes to my mind with my 7 friends is, the only place you can really do relationship is in the present. You can't
mm,
do relationship in the past because it's the past, and you can't do relationship in the future because it hasn't happened yet. And sevens can struggle to live in the present. They're that key question that they can get into asking is unconsciously is what's next, you know? What's the
mhm,
new? What's exciting? What's new? What experience can I gobble up? And they sort of can get into a pattern of staying stimulated, staying, entertainment seeking or
mhm,
adventure seeking. And of course, there's a fun side to that. There's a really fun side, but that's a gift that they bring, and there's a shadow side to that. But I think it can pulling themselves out of the present is lonely. There's a loneliness to that, um,
mhm,
to
mhm,
not being
mhm.
present. Or what
Yeah,
what what were you gonna say, Todd?
that's a great insight, Adam. Yeah, I think what comes to mind for me for sevens, again, so operating in kind of the shadow side when that's coming up is that there's a reluctance and fear to go deeper, right, into pain, vulnerability, deeper emotions, and that's you just said that, Jeff, right? That's how we connect in some ways, and so I think there's sometimes can be an experience of um, sort of superficially bouncing around in a lot of different relationships at and not going deep, and then when someone tries to go deep or something comes up, boom, they emotionally check out, they're out, they move on to the next thing. And again, it's a protective mechanism. It's understandable, like all of us have these, but
Hmm.
it's counterproductive for a deeper sense of connection, right? So there's lots of connections that sevens I think experience on a different level in terms of and having lots of irons in the fire, so to speak, right? But
Yeah.
when it comes to like, which really is what you were just saying, Adam, right? It's like being present in
Mm,
the moment with this
mm,
person in front of me or people, and being able to go a little bit deeper, I think is a struggle that can lead to a real sense of loneliness.
yeah. Should we talk about the type 8?
That sounds great. I
Let's
bet they
do it.
love it for us to talk about them.
I
They
bet
don't
they
experience
would.
loneliness. They're just happy. They're
That's
happy
right.
being independent.
That's right, that's right, that's right. And their independence is, one of the gifts that they bring, but there is a loneliness to, an over identification with independence. There is a loneliness to the fear of vulnerability. And we know, listen, all you Enneagram eights, we know that beneath the tough exterior is a tenderness, right? Um, and when you're unwilling to, and you shouldn't just share that with everybody, that would be, irresponsible, and could be dangerous to you. But when you're unwilling to, be vulnerable with, in a secure attachment with a safe person, then it does create a loneliness. Sometimes the big energy and directness and bravado, especially if eights are operating from not a very good place and they're kind of in that bulldozer mode. There can be some conflict on the whether it's in your family, with your spouse, on your team. That conflict can create some isolation and some loneliness for the type eight. But what I'm curious what you guys would add to that.
Well, just to piggyback on something you were saying, Adam, the the vulnerability and connection beneath the surface is there. It's rich. I think in some ways eights or people who identify as eight can be very connected, and they often are looking out for people who can't protect themselves, right?
Hmm.
And people who are
That's right.
vulnerable,
That's right.
probably because it's mirroring some vulnerability within them that
Mhm.
it taps into that, and they resonate with that, and so they want to protect that, and that's beautiful. But when it's below the surface, though, it's hard to see, right? So I think
Mhm.
that can lead to a sense of disconnection where other people, don't see that if they lack awareness of that and struggle to reveal that to people in some relationships, not all of them, obviously, like you said, Adam, then yeah, that can lead to, again, superficial kind of connections and relationships and a sense of loneliness.
Mm.
I remember in Sleeping at Last, their song on the eight. It's in the first stanza that they remember the moment that things switched and that they
Yeah. They
believed
picked
that they were on
yeah.
their own.
Mhm.
That attachment
Mhm.
wound, abandonment wound that gets translated, and I'll never live in a way to be betrayed again.
Mhm.
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 And that is profoundly lonely.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Profoundly. That is a significant burden for a child to bear, to be their
Mhm.
only protector, their only nurturer, their only supporter.
Mhm.
And the more that they identify with that, the more strategies, and it's almost like the stronger the independence, that's the stronger the fear that's driving the independence.
Mhm.
That's right.
Well, Adam, why don't you take us into the world of the nine?
Yeah. Yeah. Type 9. So yeah, type nines, I think, I'm married to a nine. Jeff, you're married to a nine. I think type nines in my experience can feel
My
really
nine has me, so she's never alone.
That's right. That's right.
I
That's
am
right.
so anxiously attached that she'll always know I'm there.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Uh,
Yes. Yeah. I think, nines experience loneliness when they lose touch with their own desires, when they sort of fall asleep to themselves and they merge too much with others. There can be a loneliness for themselves, even. You see this experience a lot when, for my
Exciting projects and fun things they're doing.
wife, who's a type nine, when the kids, when we got all the kids in school and, kids would go off to school and she would find herself in the house alone and she'd be like, "Who am I? What do I want to do? What
Mhm.
what do I love? What am I good at? What's my vocational identity and calling? Like, what do
it's
I want?"
so interesting, Adam. In talking
Mhm.
about Beth's sabbatical, I was reminded whenever I took my sabbatical, like, hey, don't forget to have fun. Like, sure,
Mm,
there's some internal work to do and some
that's
professional
right.
and career
That's right.
goals to kind of think through, but have fun and leisure. And she
Yeah.
was like, what? What?
Yeah.
I'm supposed
What?
to know what I want, and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I do what you do for fun.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and what yeah, that's exactly right, and what Carrie realized in that experience was how lonely for herself that she was. I mean, I'll never
Mhm.
forget it.
Mhm.
A mentor of ours, Jeff, that you and I, both know well, Rich Plass. Rich told, Carrie, he asked her the question because she did some coaching with him during this time period, and he was like, what's something you used to love? Let's start there. Like, what's just for Carrie, just for fun, what's something you used to love?" And she thought, and she's the image of her riding a bike with the wind in her hair. And he said, "How old are you riding this bike?" And she's like, "I'm probably 9 or 10 years old." And he said, "Hey, why don't you go buy a bike?" And she did. She went and bought like a
Mm,
nice
that's
bike
great.
and would drop the kids off at school on a crisp fall morning and then just go ride around our neighborhood on her bike, and it's like guilt free, just go ride your
Mm.
bike. And she's like, "I've missed this." And then what she's really saying is, "I've missed me," like, I've
Yeah.
missed me.
Mhm.
And then there's also, of course, the loneliness with others that can come from that as well. So that's, I think, the
Mhm.
nines can be the nines experience.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree, Adam. That's great insight, and that's been my experience working with nines as well. As I would describe it as disconnection from themselves, because
Mm,
oftentimes they don't know their own preferences. You kind of alluded to that. Yeah, because they get, as part of the coping mechanism, right? It's go with the flow, and they're great at
mhm.
seeing other people's perspectives, which is a, a huge strength, and that can be very valuable in all kinds of contexts, including leadership. But it sometimes can be a struggle to like find that foundation of like, what do I actually want? Like you said, prefer, desire, and who am I? And so that can lead to, yeah, a disconnection within the self of feeling pulled in lots of different directions based on other people's preferences, and that can feel pretty lonely.
Yeah, and when
Well,
you
Todd,
overlook yourself, when you overlook yourself, you also get overlooked or feel overlooked by others. Because
Mm,
and so then there's this loneliness with other people too of why don't they see me? Like does
mhm.
my presence or does my voice really matter?
Right. Great
well,
point.
Todd,
Yeah.
to wrap this back to where we began with this is that uh, in your book, The Connected Life, like you have a vision for what a connected life looks like with God, with others, with ourselves, and with creation. Tell
Mm,
us what is your vision of a connected life?
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think in kind of a nutshell, a connected life is a life in which we feel known and accepted. We've alluded to this, right? By God and by important people in our lives, right? And then we don't feel alone in our emotional pain, right? We all have struggles, we all have emotional pain, we all have suffering, things we go through. The key to flourishing spiritually and otherwise really is to not feel alone in your emotional pain, to be able to have people who feel safe to process it with, and to be able to grow through that suffering, and to, as I call it sometimes, suffer well, right? Which is to entrust your suffering to God and to grow through
Mm,
it. So that involves, this deep internal emotional security, which comes from secure attachment, comes from these relationships that are really important, that we carry in our soul, that then gives us the capacity to give and receive love and to cope with life's challenges. So that would be kind of a nutshell of
yeah.
the connected life.
And one of the interesting kind of points of need that you address in the book, and which you've actually done a little bit of research on, is the idea of attachment and attachment wounds that end up shaping or interfering with, impacting this idea of a connected life. That it's,
Mhm,
that
mhm,
attachment is more than just having a good relationship, but we carry that even in our bodies, and that
mhm,
impacts how we connect with others, our jobs, and our and how we
mhm,
connect with God through our spirituality.
mhm. Right, right. So yeah, these attachment relationships are so important, and there's a lot of, research on this. And I think we're seeing in the last, 5 years or so, more books being written about attachment that are coming up to the sort of popular level. It's I think
Hmm.
more in our consciousness now, but the research really goes back to the 1940s is when it was
Wow.
originally started to be developed by John Bowlby, who's the founder of attachment theory. And but there's a lot of research on it now, and so we've already alluded to that there's secure attachment, which um, involves basically a simple way to think about it is comfort and challenge. Those are the
Mm,
two kind of
Hmm.
basic characteristics of attachment. In the literature, it's called a safe haven and a secure base, right? So a safe haven is the comfort, secure base is the ability to kind of challenge yourself and move through things and cope and explore. And these attachment patterns are internalized and usually in place by about 12 months of age, because it's all through this implicit gut level kind of memory. So there's comfort and challenge. If a person has enough of those experiences with caregivers and is able to rely on them for those things, then they develop this internal secure attachment. But it really is the people that we rely on for those two things of, comfort when we're distressed or upset and an internal sense of security to explore the world. That's how we become attached. It's the people we rely on for those two things.
Mhm.
But as we all know that, we don't always have those experiences that are healthy and secure. And so when those aren't there, people develop insecure attachment patterns. And this, in reality exists on a continuum. We tend to talk about these as categories, but it really exists on a continuum. But basically, there's two kind of major insecure types of attachment, and there really is a third one also, but anxious attachment is one of the major ones. And so that involves really protecting oneself from expected abandonment by
Mm.
really engaging and sometimes becoming emotionally clingy with other people. So there's uh, sort of emotional dysregulation oftentimes, and they become overly reliant on other people and have trouble regulating their own emotions. They tend to lack confidence, and they tend to have what we might call an embedded stance toward their own experience, meaning when they get upset or distressed, they get sort of lost in that experience. It's difficult to take a step outside and process it and realize, okay, this is painful. I'm having this experience, but it's not going to last forever. There's some reasons why this person treated me this way. Perspective taking and that sort of thing, it becomes a struggle. So that's anxious attachment. On the other side is dismissing attachment or avoidant attachment. It's both terms are used. And that is when people shut down their attachment system, become overly self-reliant in order to cope with oftentimes experiences of rejection. And so they tend to come across as emotionally guarded and again, too self-reliant. And they're sort of a pseudo confidence. So on the surface, they appear, pretty confident, but below the surface, it's difficult for them to be vulnerable and really truly, connect with others. And so that breaks down sometimes when there's a lot of stress and there's a disconnected stance toward their experience. So they're just not very aware of, their emotions and that kind of thing. And then there's this other type, fearful attachment, that's sort of a combination of anxious and avoidant. And that's when there is a desire to connect. So for avoidant people on a conscious level, there's not really that desire to seek people out when they're upset, right? It's like, hey, I got this. I'll manage this myself because I'm not going to get hurt again, right? Whereas anxious attachment, they move toward people like, hey, I really need you, Jeff, to help me figure this out and cope with this. Fearful is, I want that connection, but I'm afraid of it because emotional connection has led to pain, abandonment, rejection. It's been associated with pain. And so there's a lot of back and forth and sometimes self-sabotaging. And it's, sometimes we see a little more association with trauma in the background, that kind of thing. So, and then back to your point, Jeff, about all of this plays out in our spiritual life because it operates automatically, subconsciously, and again, filters our experience of God. And so that's kind of what got me into this was my own journey. And then seeing this with clients where this plays out in their relationship with God, as well as in, with other people in spiritual community.
I remember a moment. There was I think it's Invitation to Silence and Solitude. I can't remember her last name, who wrote it, but so I was trying doing times of solitude and prayer and silence, and I remember being in the room of a church, and I feel like I was praying and trying to be as present as possible, but feeling so alone and distant from God.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
At that same time, I was doing some training with Allender, and it was the first time that I was introduced to attachment theory and started to realize how my own adoption and first year of life, going from foster care to my parents, could have had impact upon my life and how
Mm-hmm.
I'm experiencing God in this moment. And there was both fear, like, well, am I ever going to feel close to God?
Mm-hmm.
And also kindness, like, oh, this is biological.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can't spiritualize my way out of this thing. I can't just go try harder and things are going to get better.
Right.
And it makes sense why prayer was so difficult at times where
Right.
moving away, not feeling connected, but not liking how I'm feeling disconnected. And so I want to move away and then find myself lonely and moving back.
Right.
Um, it, it was so impactful to have this as a way of describing my experience, as
Hmm.
a way of compassion. But there
Hmm.
is a possibility of like fear, like you feel stuck in your attachment style. Uh,
Hmm.
I mean, do you think attachment styles change over time and that we experience relationship in different ways?
Hmm.
And is that what you're trying to address in the connected life?
Yes, yeah, definitely they can change. It does takes time, it takes basically new relational, what I called earlier, contrast experiences, right?
Yeah.
So in the, you may have heard the term in the psychological literature, there's this term corrective emotional experience. It goes back to, some of the early psychoanalytic
Such a
thinkers.
technical psychological
Yeah,
term,
kind of a technical
corrective
term.
emotional.
Yeah. But I like, contrast experience is a little more specific that has to do with, experiences and relationships that really um, upend your expectations. So if there's an expectation that, oh, okay, I'm going to be abandoned in this relationship again, right? Because that's just how relationships work. Or I'm not going to be seen in this relationship. And then I have an experience with someone who I feel, wow, this person really saw me in a deep way. That violates in a positive way my gut level expectation and starts to shift the internal landscape of my soul and my attachment filters
Mhm.
in a way. So they definitely do change, but we need these new
Yeah.
experiences. They don't change directly through head knowledge or explicit knowledge.
Yeah.
That is helpful to, sort of direct our lives and figure out what kinds of experiences and conditions we need to create and be in for growth, but the direct shifts at a deep level happen through new loving relational contrast
Yeah.
experiences.
I'm gonna use a technical
One
term that makes me sound smarter than I am.
Great.
But since I have Dr. Hall, or as I called you before we hit record, the Todd Father on this call, are you talking about neuroplasticity, like the ability of our brains to actually forge new pathways and healthier pathways through these corrective experiences?
Yes, that definitely ties in. All learning and development involves neuroplasticity, right? So there are brain circuits that are processing all of our experiences, including things that but definitely learning and growth and change. All of those require rewiring of our brain circuits. And so neuroplasticity
Mm,
is this term that speaks to the idea that our brains can actually change throughout our lives. And that's a new discovery in the
yeah.
last, 40, 50 years or so. That, kind of the old view was, once you hit about 25 or so, the brain
yeah.
circuits are pretty set and you're kind of done learning and growing. But, we've learned through neuroscience in the last, 40, 50 years that that's not true, that we can develop new brain circuits and grow and change throughout life. And so it really is possible. And there's new research on memory reconsolidation in the neuroscience area that's really fascinating, that speaks to this idea of these contrast experiences, that those contrast experiences seem to unlock, the brain circuits that process, some of these implicit painful emotions, and then allow for them to be sort of rewritten or rewired.
Hmm.
Mm,
So there's some fascinating work being done in that
wow,
area.
wow.
Now, Todd, you're a part of or overseeing some research regarding Enneagram types and attachment styles. Can you just comment briefly on what you guys found?
Sure. Yeah. So with my former student, now Dr. Mackenzie Connor. So shout out to Mackenzie. So this was her master's and dissertation. We worked on developing a measure that of the Enneagram using brief stories. And so people write out a brief story, tapping kind of five different, sort of areas that the Enneagram sort of taps, like a relational conflict, for example, is one of them, things of that nature. And then they rate a series of items in terms of how relevant it was in that story. And so it ends up being a quantitative score. So it's kind of an interesting, method. We wanted
Hmm.
to just, see if this would work. I'd use this method in another assessment that I worked on. And then we were also interested in how do the enneagrams type relate to attachment, if we can sort of
Hmm.
include that and figure that out. And so, the results showed we were able to develop scales for each of these types with some pretty good statistics in terms of showing that these items hang together pretty well. And then we correlated them. That's part of how you establish validity is you correlate a measure with other similar measures that are
Hmm.
independent. And we got some decent correlations. There's still some more work to do though. But when we looked at attachment, it is interesting. Some of them came out, some of the predictions, but not all of them. Um, but I can give you kind of a summary here. So type, and again, I think part of the challenge here is it's self-report, right? And as we all
Yeah,
know, Enneagram, a person's the accuracy right of their self-identification depends on their self-awareness, right?
sure.
So we don't really have a great way to to measure that. Although we did ask people, so how sure are you of your type? So we have a
Yeah,
little bit of information, but so I think that's probably to a next step would be using people who really are confident know their type, or maybe doing interviews to get at that.
hmm,
Well, what we found is a skew for type 1. I'll just go through the types of skew toward anxious attachment. So we ran correlations
yeah,
with each type and then anxious attachment and avoidant attachment, just as a basic, kind of
uh-huh,
take on this. So type 1 correlated more highly with anxious attachment. It did correlate a little bit with avoidant, but a fair amount higher with anxious attachment. Type 2, also a little bit higher with anxious attachment, but there was some correlation with avoidant as well, and that was a little bit closer. So interesting to think about, there may be some dimensions of both in Enneagram
sure.
types, right? And especially we didn't take subtypes into account at all. So that would be another
Yeah,
layer of research. Type 3 did not really correlate highly with either of anxious or avoidant, but a little bit more highly with anxious.
okay.
But I would say that's one where we need to kind of go back to drawing board, because the correlation was pretty low. Type 4, quite a bit more strongly on the anxious side, which was the prediction. That makes sense to
Mhm.
me. A little bit of correlation with avoidant, but definitely higher with anxious. Type 5, higher with avoidant, which is
Yeah.
pretty significant. Also because I've found this in doing research on attachment over the years that avoidant attachment in a self-report measure tends to not correlate as much in general with other measures. I think because there's less variability, on the measure. So people are there's not a, in other words, there's not as much of a range of scores. People tend to score in
Okay.
a more restricted range, and then that
Yeah.
impacts the ability for it to correlate with other things. So we can do a whole statistics lesson on the next podcast for people who have trouble sleeping. Um, so type 6 uh, correlated quite a bit more highly with anxious attachment and not
Yeah.
not at all really with avoidant. That actually was the cleanest, so that's pretty interesting. So you guys can
Yeah.
speak to that if that makes sense. Type 7, interestingly, didn't really correlate with either type. A teeny bit with anxious, but really not much with either. So that's one where it's like, okay, we need to go back to the drawing board and kind of figure that out. Type 8, a little bit more with anxious, and you can see the pattern, right? There's more
Yeah.
Enneagram types correlating more with anxiety. The one that sticks out that correlates more with avoidance is type 5 so far. So type 8 a little bit more with anxious, and then likewise type 9 correlated more highly with anxious. Um,
Interesting.
yeah. So
Well, thanks
yeah,
for being curious about it and even walking down that path. I mean,
yeah.
that was a sort of our hypothesis that each type could show up in uh, one of the three different ways, and it just would look unique to that type. But it is interesting to hear some initial
Mhm.
research on the topic that could be helpful for people to at least have a domain to kind of look into about their
Right.
attachment style.
Mhm.
Well, one of the things, Todd, so we've talked a lot about loneliness, applied that to Enneagram types, and capturing a vision of what a connected life would look like
Mhm.
with God and others, and how attachment style kind of and wounds can get in the way of that. You've translated all of this into not only a vision for what spiritual formation and human development could look like, but also a way of training others in helping to cultivate um, through a coaching relationship
Mhm. Mhm.
the connected life. So tell us about your relational spirituality coaching and the experience like what exactly is that experience that you're offering to people who want to become um, yeah, experts in that field?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for mentioning that, Jeff. So, yeah, I started this a little over a year ago, and it's a cohort based training program, and so we're launching the third cohort in September coming up. So we're right in the middle
And
of
I love the webpage where you said this is not a course.
yes, yeah. So it's
I loved
yeah,
it
in the
because,
sense
like you
that
said at
it's
the beginning, you're going to participate.
right, right. It's not
Mhm.
just a bunch of videos we throw at people. So it's a 12-week cohort model. So people go through together, and so we have an orientation kickoff call on September 19th is when we kick off. And so that's the first call is really just for the cohort to get to know each other. We've already got a great group of people in the cohort who've registered and signed up, and then we meet every other week on Zoom. So 2-hour call on Zoom, and that's a time to just really process the material. So we have 6 sessions, one for each of 6 modules. And so really what I've tried to do is take, I mean, really all of my learning experience from therapy and coaching and attachment and all this, and kind of distill it down into the core knowledge and steps and skills for facilitating growth and change so that people can then use this in a coaching context, but really more broadly for mentoring and discipleship. So it's
Hmm.
really aimed at people, Christian leaders who are involved in ministry that has typically some kind of focus on discipleship, mentoring, or coaching. Some of them are professional coaches, not all of them. Some are pastors. Got a really interesting, great mix of people who,
Yeah.
again, are really involved in ministry in this way and passionate about discipleship and helping people change at a deep level, like we've been talking about, and really see the need for this in the church. But people who are some business leaders. We've had doctors, physicians who are involved in, various kinds of ministry, pastors, coaches, spiritual directors, some professors. So yeah, so we meet every 2 weeks and really just process the material with each other and do some Q&A, and it's really been a blessing and a rich time. So yeah, if people are interested, they can check it out at relationalspirituality.co and get all the information there. We're right in the middle of launching this. We've got the early bird pricing is available right now until August 27th, so a little bit more time for that. And then
Yeah.
I'll be
Now you have
doing
a
a
master class that's coming up as well. It's kind of an
right.
introduction to what the program's about.
Exactly right. So that's coming up September 4th. Be doing a master class, kind of an overview of the material to help people just get a sense of it. Then leading into the program starting on the 19th. So yeah, so if
Well,
people are interested in that, they can go to the
Todd,
website and get more information about that.
and be sure to check the show notes. We'll have a link there. So all the information that you'll need to get to, a link to the books and link to the relational spirituality program, you'll be able to find that
Mhm.
there in the show notes. Todd, thank you so much. I mean, Adam and I can be quite jokesters and go on all kinds of tangents, but man, your presence, your style of relating, and just the thoughts that you're able to share are so significant and so meaningful. Like you just um, we're so grateful. You calmed our hearts down.
Yep,
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
So
absolutely.
we're so grateful for your work, and just Beth and I've been so grateful for your and your wife's friendship over the years, and your ongoing work with the Enneagram and yeah, the research. So thank you so much
Yeah,
for being with us today.
well, you're welcome. I appreciate it, Jeff. It's been, yeah, great getting to know you and Beth and you, Adam. And yeah, really appreciate you guys having me on and having this conversation.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun, Todd, and thanks for hanging with us. And to our audience, thank you for hanging with us. Remember, as always, as we say in each episode, the Enneagram reveals your need for Jesus, not your need to work harder. It is the gospel that transforms us. Thank y'all for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.